Like an oak in the acorn, Fitchburg slept for years in the wilderness. The river leaped over the rapids and glided through the meadows in freedom. "240 years ago, according to the laws of the forest, the bear, the wolf, and the fox fought among themselves and adopted the code of survival of the fittest to rule the weaker inhabitants of the forest." The green leaves of spring and the soft coloring of the falling leaves of autumn were counting the passing years. Then comes a man, a horse, an ox, a cow, a hen, a honeybee, and the plow. These are the first settlers and the emblems of civilization which guarantee a prophecy of the destruction of a forest. The sleep of centuries is broken, and the story of Fitchburg begins. Early pioneers carving their homes out of the wilderness found the rugged land as inhospitable as the Nashua River. The spring floods forced them to build on the rocky hillsides where the soil was thin and difficult to plow. The ancient rocks which make up Fitchburg's rocky hills and mountains are roughly 500 million years old. They have been subjected to heat, pressure, changes in texture, and mineral content, resulting in metamorphic rock. Not only would one have to hike more than 3,000 feet down into the Grand Canyon to find similar rock formations, but by geologic standards, Fitchburg is one of the oldest areas in the North American continent.
This is Fitchburg's second most beautiful gorge. One is on reservoir property, but this one is right here off of Westminster Street. There's a picture of it in the city and the river when the dams were actually in here. Damming up water for the mills, but this is one of the most beautiful gorges we have in the city of Fitchburg.
Towering 360 feet above the Nashua River to a summit of 835 feet above sea level, Rollstone Hill is composed almost entirely of granite. About 1 million years ago, a glacier of a mile thick ice buried New England. As it moved southward, it picked up boulders weighing thousands of pounds. As the ice cap began to melt, Rollstone Boulder was deposited on top of Rollstone Hill, becoming a landmark for Indians and early white settlers. In the early 1800s, a granite quarry was opened on Rollstone Hill. Eventually, 6 quarries produced 65,000 tons of granite per year. The nuisance pebble was finally brought down the hill to the Upper Common, where it still stands.
And in my father's youth, when he was a young man, he watched them move it from the top of the hill to where it is now. The first thing they did is they studied it very carefully, and they used pry tapping as much as possible, and they marked all of the fragment lines, and they used little black powder explosions, and they popped it into pieces that had all been marked and scheduled and so forth. Then they took these huge boulders, which of course a boulder the size of this table would be tons. They put them on drag sleds. They took it on the sleds with, I think he said, 6 horses in front and 8 or 10 behind, and men on line, many men on each side with lines. And then they'd get it started, and of course the horses in front would be on a quick release, so they'd get it moving, and then they'd be pulled, they'd be run out of the way, and then the horses behind would be doing this, keeping their foot down, and pulling back against the thing, and the men would be guiding it, and they'd slide it all the way down, and then they slid it right up to where it was, and then they assemble it all, and put it together with a cement that must have been incredibly good, because here it is all these years later.
The farmer's best friend was his ox, who pulled out tree stumps, carted stones for fencing, plowed, drew lumber, and broke paths in winter. With crude hand tools, the farmer attacked the virgin forests and often repaired his own wooden tools.
Well, you can see I did a pretty good job on my pitchfork here. This stuff's a lot heavier than I thought it was. But I'm going to do a little farmer's repair. When you get out here like this, you just don't have the resources to run around and get something new every 5 minutes. Besides, it costs money. So what I'm doing is just wrapping a little twine around here, and we'll get enough of this done so that I can make use of it. When I was up at the place up at Palmer Road, why, we're just far enough out in the woods, I almost had to take and and repair stuff like this. I just couldn't run downtown every time I needed it. So I repaired stuff. But you can see how simple this is. I'll put a couple more on before I finish this, but I get this one done, and I just stuff a little of the string through here so that it's in that loop, and you grab the end of the loop and you pull it right down tight. That piece will last all the time I'm going to have to take and bother with it, moving this stuff around. It'll work real fine for me. So typical farmer repair, and kind of a necessary thing in this old time, we just don't have anything around the street corner.
By the early 1700s, people came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony looking to appropriate land. Land spelled hope. Land meant progress from oppression. The wilderness of Turkey Hills lay untouched until Samuel Page built a log cabin and settled on land that was to become Lunenburg. He was distinguished by the honorable title Old Governor Page and well respected in the community. His son, David, was destined to be the first settler on land that was to become Fitchburg. John Fitch came to Lunenburg as a young man of 24 and built a garrison on the farthest outpost of the little settlement village. In the summer of 1748, a party of 80 Indians burned the garrison, killed the cattle, and led the Fitch family on foot to Canada.
John Fitch, he is described as medium height, and in the vigor of his manhood, he was said to be robust and strong. He was direct and sincere in speech, and with a certain measure of reserve, he was affable and dignified in manner. In character, he was said to be above reproach, and his integrity was the unimpaired inheritance of a pious ancestry. He was an honest, unassuming man. He sought no preferment and shunned no duty. He wrote a fair round hand, and a few specimens of his composition that have been preserved are expressed in clear and intelligent terms.
When Fitch and his family were released, he returned to Lunenburg and started over again. The town of Fitchburg was named for him since he was prominent in securing its incorporation. When Fitchburg was settled in 1740, the people subsisted chiefly by farming, and the population was about 250. The town was incorporated in 1764, and for 50 years after incorporation, Fitchburg was primarily a self-contained dairying and agricultural community. At the time of Fitchburg's incorporation in 1764, there were few roads, many were bridle paths, and most of the travel was on horseback. In 1793, a Boston-Fitchburg stage line opened, and the Nashua River's industrial potential was recognized. Fitchburg was chartered as a city in 1872. In the early days of the town, the settlers located around on the hills for better protection from the Indians, and the architecture of their dwellings were for the most part crude log houses, either stockaded or garrisoned, and the interiors furnished plainly with articles of necessary use. After this came the 1- and 2-story framed farmhouses with their enormous stone chimneys and fireplaces. The timbers in these houses, huge beams of the toughest oak, were well calculated to stand the ravages of time. Captain Ebenezer Bridges' home on the old Crown Point Road, now called Richardson Road, which branched north to Fisher and Scott Roads and continued over Dean Hill, is a testament to this fact. Beginning about 1740, a regular network of roads traversed interior New England, over which peddlers and stagecoaches made their way with increasing frequency over the high roads to taverns from Maine to Virginia. Dean Hill is little known to the generation of today, but in the early days of Fitchburg, it was the Upton Tavern from 1778 to 1820, a noted hostelry on the post road from Boston to Vermont.
The people that travel this road, you know, Crown Point Road and everything, there's had to be a lot of back then, you know, political people and such. I just can't help but think they had to stay here. You know, my great-great-grandmother bought this house from Jacob Upton, who built this house in 1778 as a tavern. And then he sold it to Francis Dean, Sybil Augusta Dean. Grandmother. These beams, they're all hand-hewed, put together with wooden pegs, square nails. And it was built tough to last. It's settled. You can see it's, you know, I mean, after 100 years, you know, there's been a few cracks here and there, but it is basically, it isn't that bad. Storm windows put on 2 years ago. I put on new storms. And each window is off by a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch. You can't just go out and buy. Each window would have to be separate. They have the draw that draws across the windows for storms and Indian attacks, and I can't get them to close. This little beehive of it. This would have been the kitchen area. When they had the travelers coming through, they would stay in one bed. They had to divide it between them. They'd stay in these one beds and paid like 10 cents a night to stay here. And in the morning, they would get up and when they had breakfast, it was actually a big supper. They would cook hams, chickens, grits, and I mean, they really ate it up because they would be traveling in the stagecoach. There's a rock right up front. I don't know if you noticed, that's where they boarded into the stagecoach. The base of the house, fieldstone. This is the foundation for the chimneys. On top of this is all the brickwork. And all the chimneys, you know, there's 6 flues. If you went in here, it cuts over to the other tunnel. That isn't solid down the middle. Oh, the purpose of it, you would have to dig up Jacob Upton and ask him.
The school was closed. There weren't enough students for a teacher. But when the Hurdles moved up, my family, there were 2 boys and a girl of school age, and that gave them the quantity of pupils that they needed, and they opened the school. I started at 5 because my brothers and sisters were going, and it was so simple for me to go along. My brother started the fire in the morning in the school, a wood-burning stove, and when he got through school, my sister was the next in line, and she made the fire.
when Massachusetts adopted its Constitution in 1780, Puritan beliefs had a stronghold in Fitchburg. Church attendance was compulsory, and a man who was not a church member could not vote. Early Unitarian churches had roots in the 17th century Protestant Revolution, and many ministers and congregations had come to Unitarian theology by the early 1800s. The religious history of Fitchburg begins when the Congregational church was the state church, and the town maintained public worship, furnished a church building, and paid the minister's salary. The town church of the first settlers has two direct descendants: the First Parish Church at the head of the Upper Common and the Calvinistic Congregational Church at the corner of Main and Rollstone. The Unitarian Church preached the gospel of goodness and love, the dignity of man, the validity of reason, and freedom of will and moral responsibility. The church was initially Calvinistic, but over time some members and a minister moved to a Unitarian theology, which caused a split within the church. The Trinitarians formed what became the Calvinist Congregational Church at the corner of Main and Rollstone Streets here in Fitchburg. The name First Parish remained with this building, which was built in 1834 and is the third home of First Parish Church.
In colonial America, craftsmen comprised the largest segment of the population after farmers. They were cabinet makers, silversmiths, pewterers, printers, painters, engravers, brass button makers, hatters, shoemakers, and blacksmiths. Captain Thomas Cowden, a blacksmith in Worcester, veteran of the Battle of Louisburg, moved to Fitchburg and purchased the Samuel Hunt Tavern. He became a selectman, town clerk, and member of the school board. He owned 400 acres and was the largest taxpayer in town. He was, quote, less a talker and writer than a thinker and doer, end quote.
Under a spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands. The smith, a mighty man is he, with large and sinewy hands, and the muscles of his brawny arms are strong as iron bands. His hair is crisp and black and long, his face like the tan, his brow is wet with honest sweat. He earns whatever he can and looks the whole world in the face, for he owes not any man. Week in, week out, from morn till night, you can hear his bellows blow. You can hear him swing his heavy sledge with measured feet and slow, like a sexton ringing the village bell when the evening sun is low. And children coming home from school look in at the open door. They love to see the flaming forge and hear the bellows roar and catch the burning sparks that fly like chaff from a threshing floor. He goes on Sunday to the church and sits among his boys. He hears the parson pray and preach. He hears his daughter's voice singing in the village choir, and it makes his heart rejoice. It sounds to him like her mother's voice singing in paradise. He needs must think of her once more, how in the grave she lies. And with his hard, rough hand he wipes a tear out of his eyes. Toiling, rejoicing, sorrowing, onward through life he goes. Each morning sees some task begin, each evening sees it close. Something attempted, something done, has earned a night's repose. Thanks to thee, my worthy friend, for the lesson thou hast taught. Thus, at the flaming forge of life, our fortunes must be wrought. Thus, on its sounding anvil shaped, each burning deed in thought.
In colonial times, too, a small village blacksmith, you would see him shoeing the animals, yes, both horses and oxen, but generally it's done twice a year. Once in the summer and then not again until the winter. They had summer shoes and winter shoes that they would put on them. And then, of course, there'd be the repairs, to be done on shoes. If a horse cast a shoe, he'd put it back on or make a replacement or what have you. So, the large portion of his work was doing hardware, hinges and door latches, and kitchen utensils, all sorts of tools, for the farm, like an axe or a plow. The main materials that a blacksmith works with are iron and steel. Iron was produced here in the colonies as early as 1647. Saugus, Massachusetts was the first successful iron mill. And so by the 1750s, there were a lot of iron furnaces throughout New England and all up and down the eastern seaboard. As a matter of fact, we were actually outproducing England in terms of iron at that point in time. That had England very worried because we were no longer a colony in that sense. We didn't necessarily need her imports. And we were also exporting some of the iron. So England, the Parliament passed the Iron Acts of 1750.
While the vision of the colonial lady sitting by her hearth, fire glowing while she spins wool into yarn is a romantic one, she may not have been sitting. Walking was another position for spinning. There are two basic styles of wheels, the Saxony or flax wheel, where one needs to sit, and the grate or walking wheel. The spinner's hand is the motor when using the grate wheel. As the spinner turns the wheel, the drive band transmits the motion to the spindle pulley, which puts the twist into the wool fibers, bringing them together to form a yarn. By 1750, the average family had a loom, and the children were set to work as soon as they were able to spin and card.
In the colonial time period, wool any thread was kept track of by measurement. What the utensil I have here is called a niddy-noddy. And there was a little tune sometimes that they taught the children called niddy-noddy, 2 heads, 1 body. These are the heads, this is the body. The niddy-noddies were 2 yards around. We would take the yarn off the wheel and wind it onto the niddy-noddy to measure it. 80 yards was considered a knot. Now you wouldn't break your thread, but you might take a little colored thread, tie it around that bundle, keep going. The next 80 yards you would tie the little string again. You could count up your bundles. You would know exactly how much yarn you had spun. I'm just going to finish this piece off so it has kind of an end. In order to do this, I would take the drive band off the wheel, and then there's no tension on the spindle. And I could start bringing the yarn around the niddy-noddy. There you have how the yarn is wound around the niddy-noddy 2 yards around so that we could measure it once our spindle was full and the spinning had stopped.
Fitchburg families not only pastured sheep, they also had their own flax fields. And one of the largest fields was on the Ebenezer Bridge farm. In the spring, he sowed a field of flax that was ready for pulling by July. He used the little pond at the foot of the hill to soak up the flax plants and soften the fibers. After the fibers were pounded, scraped, and combed, his wife, Mahitable, spun the flax into yarn. For nearly 2 centuries, this house has stood watch over the 5th Mass Turnpike. The original style house John Harris built was a common one of the time called a central chimney, 1 room deep, 2 rooms over 2, 1.5 stories high. Original features of the post and beam constructed home includes its 12/12 windows with wavy glass, the front door, and 3 working fireplaces, which include the old kitchen fireplace with its beehive oven. All bricks used in building the fireplaces were made across the street at the local brick mill in this part of town.
Put hardwood in it, small pieces of hardwood, and you burn it, and burn it, and burn it, because the fire is actually just heating the bricks.
Cooking was done principally in iron pots and kettles, which hung over the fire on a swinging crane suspended by hooks of different lengths.
Hello. Welcome.
Wild game, fowls, and sometimes pigs were roasted or spitted whole. The spit, an iron rod sharp at one end, being thrust through the meat and turned about before the fire while it roasted.
Beautiful chicken.
The first American cookbook was published in 1796. Prior to that time, English cookbooks were available in the colonies. The gathering of fish was an important food source, not only for many colonial families, but also for the Native American families as well. Horsehair from the tail was commonly used in making a braided horsehair fish line because of the strength of the hair and its long length. After the hay and grain were gathered and the corn and pumpkins were harvested, then came the merry husking party. On the appointed husking day, neighbors, young and old, from miles around came in wagons and carts or on horseback. It was the event of the season. The red ear was industriously sought, as it entitled the finder to kiss each fair maiden in the room. After the labors of husking were finished, baked goods, coffee, and cider were served.
No questions asked.
And the rest of the time was devoted to dancing. Days are long and hard, with both men and women working in the fields and tending the livestock. After a week of toil in building new homes and carving homes out of the virgin forest, the settlers would gather in the Red Barn on Saturday evening to enjoy dancing their old world favorites. In 1764, the tune "Speed the Plow," Scottish reel, was a staple of New England dances. There was always someone on hand who could play fiddle or an accordion. The only requirements were a wooden floor, a collar, and music. There was not much time for gaiety, so every occasion was used for socializing. People often came from miles around to see their neighbors, catch up on the news, and dance the night away in the Red Barn, somebody's living room, or the town hall. On the morning of April 19th, 1775, the signal guns boomed, and Fitchburg farmers left their fields and barns shouldering their flintlocks. British troops had set out to Concord to confiscate military supplies. In less than an hour, 42 Minutemen assembled, and headed by Captain Ebenezer Bridge, set out for Concord on foot. The first shots had been fired, and the first blood shed. About 30 men were constantly in the Army from Fitchburg during the war. Captain Bridge served through the war and left the service with the title of colonel. After the Battle of Breed's Hill, July 2nd, 1775, under a tall elm in Cambridge, George Washington took command of an army of farmers and backwoodsmen. Beside him stood Reverend Matthew Bridge, one of the first chaplains and uncle of Captain Bridge of Fitchburg. No less than 169 men served on the quota of Fitchburg for longer or shorter periods in the War of the Revolution, and this from a population of probably not more than 800 at any time during the war. Men came back from the battlefields to find the continental currency they had been paid with virtually worthless, their homes and personal property endangered by outrageous taxes. Farmers' mortgages were foreclosed for ridiculously small sums. And as resentment grew, soldiers who had fought for freedom took matters into their own hands. Fitchburg's farmers were not about to let other Americans take away their land, their property, or their liberty. Farmers grew indignant as they watched grain and livestock sold off much less than their value.
With all he's got, why would he want to take the farmer's oxen? That's the way those people think. They think they're the lords and masters of everything. They think they're the high and mighty and we're nothing. They don't care about people at all, only about having more and more things and getting richer and richer.
Without oxen was the end of the farm. In Massachusetts, where good government was scarcer than money, Captain Daniel Shea of Hopkinton and an officer of the Revolution rebelled. His recruits from the ranks of dissatisfied and disillusioned veterans took down their flintlocks, struck a spring of hemlock in their hats, and set out to close the courts. In Fitchburg, there was sympathy for the rebels, and soldiers were sent to stop disorders. During the reign of martial law in Fitchburg, Dr. Jonas Marshall was suspected of being a Shaysite, but he eluded his pursuers by hiding in a secret room under the staircase in Dean Hill Tavern. If he had been taken into custody, the soldiers would have threatened him with an oath of allegiance or jail.
Famed for the part it played in Shea's Rebellion in 1787, early Americans helped lay the groundwork for a growing nation.
Daniel Shea's was the instrument used to bring forth the need for a solid government in the form of a written constitution and its ratification. Shea's rebellion, the post-revolutionary clash between New England farmers and merchants, threatened to plunge the disunited states of the new republic into a civil war. The American Revolution had almost gone too far. In 1786, Washington was deeply concerned that the nation was teetering into anarchy. Sadly, General Washington wrote,
"I am mortified beyond expression when I view the clouds that have spread over the brightest morn that ever dawned in any country. What a triumph for the advocates of despotism to find that we are incapable of governing ourselves and that systems founded on the basis of equal liberty are merely ideal and fallacious."
The commercial elite in Boston created a mercenary army to go against the rebels. General Benjamin Lincoln was a large land speculator from Boston who collected a tremendous amount of money from 129 of his friends for a standing army. On January 20th, 1787, 4,400 men trudged west through deep snow and freezing temperatures to do battle with Shays. This radicalized the farmers, who thought they would be murdered by the mercenary army. Shays thought the only way they had a chance was to march to the arsenal in Springfield and seize the weapons that were stored there. At the arsenal, the defending militia, commanded by General William Shepard, unexpectedly fired. Killing 4 rebels and wounding 30. After a 30-mile march, General Lincoln surprised the insurgents in Petersham, who retreated in disarray and fled to New Hampshire and Vermont. The back of the rebellion was broken.
Get away this way.
Captured rebel leaders were charged with treason and sentenced to hang.
Rebellion against a king may be pardoned or lightly punished, but The man who dares to rebel against the laws of a republic ought to suffer death.
The question of clemency was now a symbolic issue, debated by a divided public. General Lincoln favored mercy. In the end, Shays was pardoned. Although his name was the rallying cry of the rebellion for as many as 9,000 New England farmers, he felt ambivalent about his leadership. Jefferson, from France, would write,
"A little rebellion now and then is a good thing. It is a medicine necessary for the sound health of government. God forbid that we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion."
During the 1840s, business and political talk about town focused on railroads, and a priority was placed on a line from Fitchburg to Boston where rail systems and ships could move goods efficiently. The potato famine in Ireland sent starving immigrants to America. In 1843, Alva Crocker offered the penniless Irishman employment on rail gangs for $1 a day. On Saturday, the 13th of April, 1861, Fitchburg received news that Fort Sumter had been attacked and was gallantly holding out. But the following day, Fort Sumter had unconditionally surrendered. President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers, and the Irish of Fitchburg enlisted enthusiastically with their New England counterparts to quell the rebellion. Fitchburg has a record to be proud of. Fitchburg sent 9 companies into the field during the Civil War, filled its quotas under all calls, and had a credit surplus of 75 men above demands.
Like noble soldiers, they stood uncomplaining, shells finding big, lovable targets.
Joseph Hooker, known as Fighting Joe, was a career U.S. Army officer and a major general in the Union Army during the American Civil War. He's best remembered for his stunning defeat by Confederate General Robert E. Lee at the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863. He had a reputation as a ladies' man and a hard-drinking social life, even on the battlefield. Hooker is a relative of the well-known Donald "Frenchie" Maynard, who still lives in Fitchburg. The cornerstone of the Massachusetts State House was laid by John Hancock, who previously used the location as a cow pasture. The building was completed in 1798. In front of the building is an equestrian statue of General Joseph Hooker.
Let memory bridge the years. Look back. Remember Fitchburg in the 1800s. A lovely time to be alive. A hopeful time. A looking forward time. A time to flourish and to grow. A town of go-ahead people building for today with an eye on tomorrow. The valley town that stretches along the Nashua and climbs the sharp hills has no more than 5,000 people and the friendliness of a village.
Come on, son, it's been a long, hot day. Father's gonna take us to a ride at Pearl Hill Road after supper.
The boy hears his mother call.
Mother, is Mr. Snow ever gonna get a bell for that old steeple?
Someday, son, someday.
The boy looks across Main Street at the Trinitarian Church, a small brick building somewhat back from the street with green fields on either side. She smiles at the boy. May 30, 1854. President Franklin Pierce signed the Kansas-Nebraska Bill. By the terms of this bill, settlers in the territory could vote whether Kansas should be free or slave.
Young men are needed in Kansas, Mother. Give me your good word to go.
Think you could plow an acre before sunup? It's farmers and mechanics are needed in Kansas.
Words are weapons, too. Someday I aim to go to Kansas.
Yeah, not printers' devils. January 29, 1861. Kansas entered the Union, a free state. But the joy of victory after the bitter struggle was blotted out by the sound of marching feet, the beating of drums, and the bugle's call to defend the Union. In Lawrence, Kansas, rising conflict focused on the Kansas Free State Journal. The editor was young Josiah Trask. It is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. A posse of guerrillas move into town, headed for the Kansas Free State office. A brick crashes a window, then another. Friends caution Josiah Trask. Better give up newspapering. Josiah shakes his head. No, he answers, I will die for Kansas. The guerrillas are still pounding, shouting at the men inside to come out and go yonder to the Eldridge house.
What is it, Hosea?
Rhoda, you mustn't be afraid. So quiet down. Plus, I'm gonna take you back home to Fitchburg just like I was promised.
Don't go. Remember what they did at the pin shop?
Rhoda, there's no turning back now. I made my choice long ago.
Josiah steps out the door, his head held high, fearless and trusting as always. Never in his life had Josiah carried a gun. He carries none now. They shoot him down. Josiah Trask came home to Fitchburg. We are gathered here to pay tribute to Josiah Trask. Many of us knew him as a boy. He passed through the troubles of bleeding Kansas, and throughout the struggle was a staunch supporter of liberty. He has been stricken down. Once Josiah said, I'll die for Kansas. Aye, and he has died in the freshness of his young renown. Oh, reverently, my country, yet with pride, give him his well-earned due. Sitting beside her husband, Josiah's mother hears the words of Reverend Mr. Davis, but is hardly aware of their meaning. They skim over the surface of her mind, never plumbing the depths, where memories of happy hours lie safely stored away. In the doorway, the sight of the sexton's arms reaching up for the bell rope stabs her sharply awake. Never would she forget bent snow ringing that bell for the first time when the slaves were freed. Oh, blessed freedom! She watches the sexton pull the rope with all his strength. Suddenly, far above her, the air is alive with pealing sound from the temple. Ruth Trask turns to her husband. Josiah always wanted to hear that bell.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child.
No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. And therefore, never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee.